Welcome. Today I'm here with Benjamin Keep. He's got a YouTube channel and where he talks about learning science. And I recently came across his videos and I've been doing a deep dive on him and everything he teaches. He's got a JD from Cornell Law School and a PhD from Stanford University in learning sciences. So I'm pleased to have him here today. And Benjamin, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so I thought it'd be fun to start off with one of the questions you probably get a lot, which is, what is your tech stack? So what is your hardware? What is the software that you use? And, maybe you can give a little description of each of what you like most about it.
Sure. I guess maybe this is a difference between me and a lot of other people, but I don't really use many apps or these things. I'm trying to
Like
think
you
of
use
what.
Notion, Obsidian, OneNote,
None of that.
none of
Nope.
that. So you're just text documents?
Yeah, I mean, if I am using if I'm working on something, I'll open a text document on like Google Drive or something, or yeah, even just like a Microsoft doc.
Mhm.
And I'll write in there, I'll take notes in there, I'll refer back to things. I have used Scrivener on occasion
Okay.
for writing, and also for kind of like a modified Slipbox, or what's the
Zettelkasten.
Zettelkasten. Yeah, I've kind of used Scrivener cards, because you can create cards and kind of incorporate references, and then but I go back and forth on that. I haven't been very consistent on it.
Okay.
I use occasionally for kind of visualizing things. I use Miro,
Mhm.
which is more for businesses to kind of visualize processes and stuff like that and do brainstorming. I just more use it as a blank canvas that I can manipulate things on, and
Mhm.
occasionally I'll use it for like presenting an idea on. Um, for writing like YouTube videos, I've found I just use Keynote, and I just script things on Keynote, and I
So you're
find
a
that to
Mac
be.
guy, MacBook
Yeah,
Pro.
I'm a Mac guy. I mean, I don't. Everyone had Macs in law school. I don't know why. I needed a new computer. I bought one, and I've used one ever since. Uh, I don't. I've used ClickUp. I think ClickUp is quite good.
Really?
It's a productivity software, kind of, and one of the benefits that it has is that it you can visualize things in different formats. So you could visualize things as like spreadsheets, or as kind of like process flows, and I think it just incorporates a lot of what you would want in a productivity software. Again, I've used it for a little while. I liked it, but I'm always I
Like when
tend
you
to
were in
use
law
the
school, what were you
simplest
doing?
thing.
Like just pen on paper or
When
just,
I was in law school,
yeah.
yeah, pen on paper, and then I would summarize things in documents. I mean, I wasn't a terribly good law student, so I wouldn't put much stock into that. But I tend to use, like, I personally, I find most software to like there's kind of a startup cost, right, to learning how to use a particular software and to kind of incorporate it.
Mhm.
And so and then a lot of times there are features that I just don't need or don't use, and so I tend to kind of revert back to the simplest possible thing,
Right.
which a lot of times is just a document.
I
And I
mean,
probably could be more organized. Occasionally, I use Google Calendar. I mean, I use Google Calendar to schedule things. I use
yeah.
Calendly to schedule things. I think Calendly is a really great app for doing. It does one job, and it does it really well.
Yeah.
Um,
So,
those are the kinds of apps I like.
I mean, one of the things I wanted to kind of like a little bit more of an advanced topic is this. I see there being two different cultures within, and this latter one isn't even super existent, doesn't even really exist in academia, which is I call the sell side of learning, which is teaching and kind of you're imposing a system on the students and the classroom. And then the buy side, which is you're an individual learner, probably graduated from college, and now you're on your own. You've got a 30-40 year career. You need to continually be learning stuff, and you're in charge of that, and you've got to figure out what the right process and pacing and project management for all that is. So you're going and finding books and online courses and reading articles and Googling stuff. So one of the challenges I had with reading the literature is that it tends to focus on if I, as the teacher, want to set things up ideally for the students, how do I do that? But when you're the student, you don't get to control any of that. And so you really have to work with what's given to you and make the best out of that, of what you're given. So even if you know the teacher could be using a better method, ideally, they're not doing it. And it would be so expensive for you to, on your own, kind of convert everything over to the ideal system, that you kind of have to use a lot of, I think of it in terms of like NASA. Like you could have everything in your home designed by NASA with like the best material science and the lightest weight and never breaks and all that kind of stuff, but it would cost millions of dollars. So I'm curious kind of how you apply knowing what the ideal situation is, and then in the real world it's almost never like that, and so you have to make the best you can out of, you know, just the normal book or the normal course or the normal article. Like how do you integrate those two?
Yeah, I mean, let me preface this. I'm not sure if what I'm going to say is going to directly answer that question. I don't know, but we can see, and you can see if this is going to relate at some point. What one of the keys, I think, to effective learning in either in a more formal setting where you're learning from a teacher or in a less formal setting is that the student has some amount of control and some amount of self-awareness of kind of what they're doing, what they're learning, and kind of how to learn from different kinds of resources. And so when I think about, for instance, like textbooks, I actually think if students a lot of times seem to complain about textbooks or say that they're boring or you know, not engaging enough and this kind of thing. I think if you can't learn from a textbook, you have a problem.
Yeah.
Like, and I think a lot of people can't learn from textbooks, right? Like, and it's not to say that that it's their fault that they can't learn from a textbook, but that that skill is an important thing. And it's not just textbooks, right? I mean, it's any kind of resource that ultimately, if we were to design kind of ideal educational system, we would be trying to develop this skill that, you know, I mean, you can call it kind of learning to learn or whatever, but I think it's a skill of partially a factor of like not being intimidated by things, but centrally a kind of a way of sucking out what you need to figuring out what you need to learn and figuring and kind of sucking out what you need from these different resources. And I think it's weird because in some ways, I think in a kind of moving over to the formal setting for a second, like students in a lot of formal settings, like say your typical undergraduate student, and I speak on this, I mean, because I was a very typical undergraduate student, you know, you kind of expect the teacher to, you kind of expect attending class and kind of doing the normal things that you are going to learn from that. And you're going to learn some things, but instead of having an attitude of like, I am in control and I am going to take charge, and I'm going to do the things that I think is necessary to
Mhm.
kind of further my learning. And at the same time, so it's like in one sense, students tend to, in this formal setting, tend to listen to teachers too much. I feel like, because they just accept like, well, I'm just going to do the thing, and that's just, I'll just follow the teacher's
And
lead.
anybody in higher ed really doesn't have any education in how to teach, so that's a key problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there are people in higher ed who care deeply about teaching and who work really hard on improving their teaching for sure. For sure. And people who have developed a very high level of skill, and really I think it goes beyond a single class. It goes into kind of the coordination of departments, and how classes lead into one another, and how good teachers teach other teachers. But that's like a very small slice of the academic pie. I think that, I mean, the vast majority of teachers, and this is, I mean,
Like
fundamentally,
K through 12 teachers are legally required to go and learn a lot of stuff that you got your PhD in. I'm just saying they're not required to do it. So they may
right.
do it, they may.
And the incentive structure is not there. Like,
Yeah.
no one, I mean, you have to meet a bare minimum standard, basically. Like, your students can't absolutely hate you and want to murder you.
Yeah.
And you can't do certain, untoward things,
Yeah.
or say certain things, right? But that's like the bare minimum. All your
Right.
incentives are based on publishing, and kind of, are you a kind of team player, and are you getting grants, especially at the more research oriented schools.
Mhm.
Um,
So
but yeah, I mean,
I
I
guess
think
more
students.
personally,
Yeah.
where do you find you as an individual when you're reading a book, when you're taking a course, when you're reading an article? What do you find that you're doing differently because you have this knowledge from your PhD that a normal student wouldn't be doing?
I think the most important thing is that I don't think that just reading, or like, I know that, um, the feeling that I have in the moment when I'm reading something and I'm thinking, oh yeah, I get this, I understand this. I know that that is not the same as actually applying that information in a meaningful way, in a meaningful context.
Is there a good
And
analogy for that? I feel like is there another experience people have of like where you're just way off? You're like, you think it's 90% and it's really 10%.
um, good question. You know, there are, I mean, there's a really whole literature on these like cognitive biases, and you might consider this a form of cognitive bias, where
Yeah.
you you kind of think you have learned more than you have, because
It's kind of like a
the
sugar high, actually. Like when you have a really, you eat a, have a big dessert for lunch or something, you feel really good for like 10 or 15 minutes and then
mm,
you crash.
you
So,
crash. Yeah, that a similar thing is like the things that you are excited about right now, or you might, I mean, not to take this into an odd direction, but like, um, there's the research on kind of what turns people on
mhm.
at different moods, at different points, in time. And it's like, what, the thing that you really want to do right now is not the thing that you really, you feel like you're going to really want to do later on.
Mhm.
Um, it the our preferences are shaped by our moods, and it's kind of the same thing here, where you have this feeling in this moment of reading something that's very, you feel like you're really understanding, or you're knee deep in reading it,
Mhm.
but that's just not the same as what it's going to be like 3 weeks from now, when you are using that information or using that knowledge in some way.
You have a
um,
video on desirable difficulty. Could you pull that? Like, I really want to stick on this topic of like when you, because you have another interesting video that's on like the experience of learning. And I think that it's kind of like, I guess another example is like you're in the gym and where you're really building muscles when you start to feel a little bit of pain, but you also don't want to have so much pain that like you're about to pull something or break something. So there's that zone where it's a little bit beyond where you're super comfortable with, but it's not, it's like 5 pounds more than you did last time, but it's not 25 pounds more.
Mm,
So like
mm.
you're trying to get in that zone and you get to a certain point where you know that's like you're supposed to be feeling a little bit of discomfort and this is going to pay off and it feels good. And so I think that like a key part of um being an accelerated learner and kind of having this expert level of experience of it is, you know, when to push through the discomfort. You know that sometimes you're going to be having ideagasms and being just really eating bonbons of knowledge, but then other times it's going to be a little bit of a slog, but you know it's going to pay off. And you make the right, you allocate the chips in the right way in the full process of learning a subject.
I think that's a very, yeah, a very good description of where, you know, there are certain things. Obviously you're going to have these moments, as you say, where you're just like, oh man, like I'm really like, oh, finally things are clicking into place, and those moments are great. But there's a lot of things that we can do to make things seem harder. I mean, one of the simplest things that people and there's some research on this, a lot of people seem to endorse this idea that, you know, when they evaluate strategies to learn something, they think that a less effortful strategy, the less less effortful strategies are more effective. That's what people tend to believe, but the reality is almost, I mean, almost the opposite. Obviously you can waste effort. You can spend a lot of effort in an unproductive way, but there are lots of study strategies that are just more effortful. They feel harder. They result in worse immediate outcomes. So you don't feel like you've learned as much. You're not performing quite as well as you were. But in the long run, they're going to serve you much, much better. And so,
But there's also, even though that's not a perfect correlation, because you have things like, you have a video on speed reading and it's, you know, pretty much all these meta-analyses have shown that it's not effective, or at least it's very marginally effective. So that's an example of something that gives you a false sense of confidence that you're actually achieving something and it maybe feels easier. The flip side is, and I think this was in one of your other videos, you talked about like how to take notes in a lecture, and like some people just write down every word. That's an example of somebody who's putting in a ton of effort, and they maybe think, or they're rereading over and over again or highlighting like meticulously, and they never have that paradigm shift of, you need to practice retrieving, you need to like ask yourself questions and be quizzing, and it's kind of counterintuitive.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think some of those efforts. I mean, I mean, if you sit down and take notes in a lecture, especially a lecturer whose pace is fairly fast, like you feel like, oh, I'm working so hard, and you are working hard. It's just that hard work is not really directed to the right kind of cognitive work that needs to be done.
I think a funny, like, I think there is kind of an interesting counter argument, and I could even imagine in law school this would be particularly relevant, where they sometimes try to trick you, or they try to like test you on like a little thing they mentioned in a lecture, where sometimes I think it does make sense to kind of transcribe what's being said, because then you can go back to it later and create your flashcards. And I had an interview with Prerak Juthani, who's an MBA, MD at Stanford also, I think. And so he, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. What was I just talking about before I said his name?
Writing cases
Oh
where
yeah.
you would want to write down
So I
something from
guess,
the lecture.
yeah, Stanford records all the lectures. So a lot of students at Stanford Medical wouldn't go to the lectures. They just watch the videos of the video stream, and then they turn that into flashcards. And then it would even go to the point where you make the flashcards on this lecture, I'll make the flashcards on that lecture, or the whole class would collectively have flashcards in some shared Google Doc or something. So I think there is something to be said for separating the two tasks of making an exact and accurate, just like in a court case, you have the stenographer creating that exact transcript. You want to make sure you're capturing the exact information, and then you're making flashcards, or you're however you're memorizing the right stuff. So I think that's the case where it makes sense, but it's not the case that transcribing it by hand or typing it by hand is going to help you memorize it. So if you're doing it purely to capture things accurately for later processing, that's good potentially. But if you're doing it as a way to memorize, that's where it's a false desirable difficulty. It's fool's gold.
Yeah, I mean, I think that another people, some math students have kind of appeared in my comments sometimes mentioning like, hey, yeah, in math classes, like a lot of some of the tricks that they're teaching us, like they'll only talk about it one time in one class, and it doesn't appear in any books or anything that they have that they're using. It's like, yeah, and that part of it depends on how rare is this information, and if we go back far enough in time, pretty much all of that information was where you weren't going to be reading what the lecturer was saying, and now it's much more common to, yeah, I mean, you can have recorded lectures. Sometimes, or a fair amount of times, lectures are duplicative of textbook material.
If they're reading the textbook out to you, that's one thing. But sometimes, I mean, this goes back to my original thing where it's like, if the course was designed perfectly by somebody like you, then everything would be in the textbook, and there wouldn't be all these little tricks that they're doing either intentionally or unintentionally. And so you could kind of learn in a more efficient way. But because of the human error and all the inefficient things that are going on, you have to compensate for that. And that compensation is not wrong, even though it may go against what the ideal Platonic version of learning would be.
Yeah. I mean, I just think it just depends on your situation, what you want to do.
Yeah.
And I do think understanding what the baseline should be, and then understanding kind of why I might want to deviate from that in one direction or another is really important.
So could you, I'm just curious about your background. Could you talk a little bit more about like what you did going through, like anything unusual in terms of K through 12 extracurriculars or anything like that, and then going on to your anthropology degree and then your JD PhD? I'm just curious kind of what your story is, especially like academically, like your interests and stuff.
So when I was in fourth grade, I entered into an art school where we went to school for an extra hour every day. I was in like a gifted program briefly, and then that kind of petered out. And then I was in this art school for probably 5 years. I was a theater major.
Cool.
And that was a very small school.
Were you an actor or director? Like, was there any specialty to it?
Okay. It was all, I mean, the students were the actors. We did do some writing, but I'm not sure if, I'm not sure. It was a bit angsty, I'm sure, middle school kind of level. But the academic teachers were very good. Had a fantastic math teacher, had a fantastic social studies teacher, had a very good English teacher who I only realized was good after the fact, because she was kind of strict. So I didn't like her that much during the time period. But having those great teachers, I think, really made me love school. Like I generally speaking, like and I'm kind of a social person. I liked doing the plays and everything like that when I was a kid. I don't know. I probably had rather be involved in like, if I could make money doing community theater, I would. But
Some of your
then
YouTube intros kind of, you do have kind of a flair for the like, how do I, there's the one where you drop the books and stuff and they like kind of.
I'm trying, man. Like, you try to do a million different things
Yeah.
to see if this is gonna work, is that gonna work? And then later on, sometimes I've had this experience where, you watch a video later on, you're just like, wow, that was terrible. And then later on, you watch a video and you're like, actually, it's not that bad. It's
Yeah,
okay,
Yeah.
But yeah, then I was in my brother was in this math, science, technology program, and so I got into that as well for a year, and then we moved to a different place. And I don't know, I've always been interested in like both arts and kind of math stuff, math, science stuff. And I was really interested in martial arts for a while, did a kind of traditional martial art for quite a while until I injured myself and moved away.
Which one?
It's called Shinto Muso Ryu. It's
Okay.
basically a stick versus a sword. It's yeah,
Never heard of that.
not exactly. It's a very kind of traditional formal thing.
Is it kind of like fencing, but
it's kind of like it's similar to kendo in a way, in that like, you're kind of fighting, but it takes place in these specific forms, and there's rituals associated with it. So there's not any competition. There's not any.
So is it Japanese?
Yeah, Japanese.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you did that and then what else?
I did that for a while. And then
yeah.
when I was in WashU, I didn't. I mean, again, typical undergrad. I wanted to study kind of evolutionary processes in society. I didn't really know what to major in. I ended up majoring in anthropology just because I took some classes that I thought were interesting. It was fine. I was more interested in martial arts at the time, and playing. I got really into playing Go in college,
Oh, wow.
in high school and college. I spent a year in between high school and college. I was in Japan. I was really interested in Japanese culture. Tried to learn the language a little bit, traveled around there and taught English. And then I spent some time in South America as well, where I realized I didn't know how to speak Spanish at all, even though I'd taken 5 years of Spanish, which was kind of sad. And then,
you mentioned evolutionary processes. What does that mean?
Oh, like how societies change and what drives change, and how we can. Well, now I'm more interested in kind of how can we craft societies that are more adaptive, more effective at creating knowledge and applying that knowledge wisely. So when we're talking about the science, talking about the science of learning, or research on learning, kind of, one of the big things there is there's this large gap between what the research suggests that we should do and then what we end up doing. I mean, we being a kind of collective, like teachers and students.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this, you talked earlier about teachers getting certified to teach, but sadly there's still a lot of misinformation that's being
learning styles
in professional development and other things. And at the cost of like not teaching the real stuff too. It's not just like you're teaching misinformation, but you're also like, hey man, where's the real research stuff? And so yeah, that's my main interest, I guess, is how to.
But it's interesting you took the anthropology route, because that tends to be less developed cultures, right, as opposed to sociology.
Oh, I mean, you can do anthropology about it. I mean, people have done like, hey, I go to a casino every day and I study, the culture at the casino.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely is more traditionally like I go outside, way outside my modern culture, and live, among some tribal, kind of modern tribal culture. But yeah, I mean, there are so many different kinds of. I mean, there's linguistics is generally speaking part of anthropology. There's archaeology is generally speaking part of anthropology. There's a kind of like, there's like the social theory stuff. There's the cultural stuff. There's the physical anthropology. So it's kind of like how have what's the past, 250, or I guess I mean, several million year history of the development of human bodies and brains.
So kind of like evolutionary theory applied to the brain, rationality, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think like most of the evidence is on kind of physical things, but like bones and that kind of thing. But yes, I mean, you can start to, I mean, eventually you get into this area, this kind of fuzzy area of I think it's called evolutionary psychology,
Yeah.
where it's let's just say there are a lot of unsubstantiated or sketchy things that are done in that area, but not all sketchy things. I mean, I think there are some good research too. There is some good research too in that area. But yeah,
Okay, so
I
you did
yeah,
that, and then
and and at the end of school, well, during college to make money, I played poker for a living, and
oh, I was
so
gonna actually, I just wanted to flag something. You have a great interview with a chess YouTuber. It's almost 2 hours. I listened to most of it, um, where you talk about applying learning strategies to chess, and you mentioned to Go a few times in there. So I'd recommend people check that out. And chess and Go have been big in the AI community in terms of advancing things, and Go most recently. A lot of people thought like they'll never be able to do this. Jeopardy also. So that's just a side thing, but people should check out that interview as well. So you did Go, you played poker, AI in poker as well has been a big thing. So, but yeah, you played poker and made money that way.
yeah, and so then I didn't know what I wanted to do after I graduated, and so I
Was it
was like,
online poker or in person?
oh yeah, online poker. This was like the poker boom
This was
of
the
the like
okay,
late
late two
aughts, I
thousands. Yeah.
guess. I
Okay.
guess like 2004 was, I think, when Chris Moneymaker won big at the World Series of Poker or something like this. And there was a number of kind of big, it was being televised more often and everything. And at the time, I mean, you didn't have to be that good. I'm not a great poker player, but you just have to be better than the other people that you're playing with.
Yeah.
And so I got used to playing. So I would, yeah, do the like, play 6 tables or 8 tables at once kind of
Really?
thing.
Wow.
Um,
I mean, I
because
want to
you're
dwell on
folding,
that. Yeah, good.
yeah, you're folding like 80% of your hands. So I mean, occasionally you have these crises where you have a couple of major hands that you're involved in at the same time. But yeah.
So I want to
Uh,
dwell on this actually because I didn't fully. I knew there was chess and Go, but I think you've kind of. I think of especially chess and poker. Like, what is what does that do to your brain when you have a fair amount of competency in it? Because it's kind of like we talked before we started recording on you have a smattering of different languages and French, German, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese. It sounds like
I have attempted
you have attempted like a
these
little.
things. I
That's
have
why I
not.
say smattering.
Yeah, I've not reached fluency
Yeah.
in most of them. It's just like when I go to Germany, I learn some German because I think it's fun and yeah.
So and that kind of gives you a better sense of grammar and deep kind of ontology and stuff. So in the same way, how does having poker, Go, chess, are there any others that
Magic. I play
magic?
Magic more
Um,
casually, but I do enjoy the game quite a bit.
so how similar, by the way, is magic to Pokemon? Is it much more advanced?
I've never played Pokemon, so I can't
Okay.
speak to it. As I recall, I think Pokemon doesn't involve resource management as much. You could just play your cards whenever you want. I think that's correct.
It
With Magic,
sounds about right. Yeah.
you have like lands that you have to kind of manage to figure out like certain things cost different amounts of kind of
So it's almost like an
resources.
RPG game as opposed to just like a head to
In
head like
some
fight.
ways, yeah. In some ways, yeah. There is that aspect to it. Yeah. Um,
So what does that do to your brain when you have like a pretty significant, not a professional, but like a decent amateur level of like 9 out of 10 people who, play
right.
very casually, you're probably better than them. So what does it do to have multiple of those in kind of these different major areas of like strategy game, different, yeah, like what have you noticed?
So it's a good question. I mean, actually, I've been wanting to talk about strategy games my whole life, because yeah, I first of all, I want to say that I mean, I don't think like you can get very good at one thing, and kind of when you get very good at one thing, you kind of your brain ends up changing in specific ways, so you see things in a certain way. And so if I were to say only play Go and get really, really, really good at Go, I have a very deep understanding of that. And there's a lot of like automatic patterns that come to mind. There's both like kind of the kind of conscious decision-making aspect. There's the kind of automatic pattern matching. And really, from the research on chess, it seems like there's a huge amount of expert, kind of your expert level is determined by, maybe not a huge amount, but a say 60% or something like this. On just to give people an idea of what we're talking about, is determined by kind of just like how good are you at matching the patterns. But when you have like, and I didn't,
Which is kind of like you have an encyclopedic, basically, encyclopedia in your head of patterns, and like how big is that? How many pages in that?
Right. And well, it's also like how fast does it come to mind, like, and how quickly like everything comes. It's not like you have to search through the encyclopedia. It's like this immediate
So it's almost like
notice,
vocabulary, like
yeah,
you have
it's like
it,
you
it's
notice
fluent.
one little thing and automatically you're thinking the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have that level really really in any of these games. And so the benefit of learning anything that is kind of like different examples or different kind of different domains, but some of the same underlying concepts, is that you get a sense, like you start to abstract things at a different level. So it's like if you see, so both Magic and poker are games of partial information. You can't see what's in the opponent's hand, but the way that they play out and the information that you get throughout the game is very different. So you're both making predictions about, say, what might be the next card that someone plays in Magic, or what are the cards, like you're kind of starting out with a wide range in poker, and then as people make their bets or calls or whatever, then you start to narrow down, like what could they, and you see the cards laid out in the center. You start to narrow down what their possible range might be. And so it's like a similar process happening in two different contexts, and that gives you a deeper understanding. So if you were to give me another strategy games, I love strategy games, by the way. If you were to give me another strategy game, hopefully, I mean, I think that I have a decent shot at like more rapidly understanding kind of, I have these basic concepts that I've abstracted from these different instances. And then, if you give me another game, then I can
Do you play with your kids, by the way? Do you think this is stuff that's useful for kids to be?
I mean,
Is it a life
skill?
skill?
Yeah, I mean, I to the degree that he will tolerate it, I will play any strategy game with anyone,
Like, what
including my
other
son.
strategy games are like? Do you play console or computer strategy games, or just other board
I mean,
strategy
I was
card?
pretty into. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure everyone was pretty into StarCraft at some point when I was a kid. When I was in high school, everyone was playing that game, or World of Warcraft, um, um, or Red Alert. Anyhow, the like, yeah, I mean, I view games as kind of like, they're nice because they are little mini models of decision making, and you have to kind of make lots of decisions, and you have to look at kind of what evidence you have for making this kind of decision, and you have to consider the benefits and trade-offs of doing something. And so that, and the games which are rich, which involve, say, like complicated trade-offs, or where it's unclear, you're always a little bit uncertain as to what the best thing to do is, and maybe there's overlapping concepts that maybe like is useful, and this concept is useful in this situation, this concept is useful in that situation. Those are the kinds of games that I like to play, and I think that I just think that as models, these games are interesting analogs to other decision-making things, decision-making and policy-making, decision-making,
I
when
was going to say in law,
learning
like
something.
a settlement or just a case in general, or thinking about how rules and regulations shape a situation, create incentives, that kind of game theory. I mean, it is, I guess you could say, applied game theory. My personal sense is that I get a lot of that from reading history. So, to me, I don't think that beyond a certain point of playing strategy games, you're getting a significantly better understanding of game theory, the math of it. So I think it's at that point more for enjoyment, or maybe there's a psychological factor of the gamesmanship of the other person in poker, for example. I could see how that transfers, but I'm kind of skeptical that somebody who's just really good at game theory, like like, baby Mozart and these brain training games, like, my feeling is that there probably isn't a huge amount of transfer beyond probably the point that you've gotten to in these games.
I think in general, transfer is really, really hard, and it generally doesn't happen as often as people think it does. And I certainly did not play these games with any kind of intentionality as to like, this is what I'm going to learn from this game. It's more just like I enjoy them, and I've over time you learn things from your experiences, hopefully.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about Josh Waitzkin, because he's kind of an interesting example of chess prodigy. He wrote the book The Art of Learning, and then he went into Jiu-Jitsu and maybe some other business stuff, but he kind of, it seemed like he had some kind of theory of transferring from chess to jiu-jitsu. And I guess I'm on his website right now. Josh is a BJJ black belt under 9-time world champion Marcelo Garcia. He's the co-founder of the Marcelo Garcia Academy in New York City and creator of mginaction.com, the revolutionary online Brazilian jiu-jitsu and submission grappling training. So I think he got into the grappling and submission side of it, especially, which is probably the more intellectual side of things. So do you have any thoughts on that in terms of transfer from like chess to martial arts?
I have no thoughts.
Okay.
I don't know him, and I don't really I don't know
Okay.
much about that. I do think that, I mean, this kind of comes back maybe to some of the things we were talking about earlier, but if you are orienting yourself in the right way, you will be automatically looking for analogies between things. So it's, it's not crazy to reach a very high level in one thing, and then maybe you start to do something else, and it's like you're already seeing the world. It's the same way as if you were like you're an economist. You see the world in a certain way, the way that you have largely been trained to see it in, and you have had some direction in that as well. But economists tend to use regression methods, and they kind of see data through those methods to some degree. And so in the same way, it's like you get really, really good at chess and you see the world through that lens. And so then when you're looking at something else, you're naturally going to draw certain kinds of analogies to to jujitsu, whereas someone else maybe coming at it from a different angle might be drawing a different kind of analogy, maybe that's no worse or no better than yours necessarily. But I think it's natural to draw like analogical
Yeah.
relationships between things as you're learning, especially if you're going about it in the right way.
So circle back, I asked you about your kind of intellectual history, and we didn't get to, we got to
Sorry.
anthropology. So how did that transfer over into, or not transfer over, but how did you, what happened next? And was there anything in between that and law school?
No, I mean, I was playing poker and I was getting bored with it. And you know, I was just kind of like, is this all I'm gonna do? Like,
Right.
I'm literally just gonna play poker and take other people's money? Like, this seems
How
like a
much were you
lame,
making, like per hour,
not
per
much.
day?
I mean, I was making like, 50, $60,000 a year, but I was playing like 15 hours or 10 hours a day. I mean, I was going to the library a lot. I was not, and it's like I don't want to play any more than that,
Mhm.
really. I mean, um, but then I mean, things were getting sketchy as well. Like, well, one of the events that happened was that there was um, a law or kind of a rider onto a bill that was passed in Congress that made it a lot harder to get money out from these online poker places. So for a while, I was getting money like wired to me through Western Union from someone I don't know from the Philippines,
Oh,
and it's just like this is a little sketchy, and it made
yeah.
me. I remember at the time it made me very very angry that the that Congress had kind of done this. It was kind of under a kind of moral kind of approach to
Yeah.
like, hey, we need to prevent this online gambling thing. It's not very moral, so we should kind of tamp down on it. Um, and so that's what made me think about law school more seriously. It's just I'm like, there shouldn't be laws. The bad laws shouldn't be made. That's bad. And so I was kind of like, and I had thought a little bit about law school before. I had taken a law class in undergrad and really enjoyed it.
Mhm.
And I mean, I should have been smarter, but instead I was like, yeah, why not? This seems good. I really want to understand how the kind of legal system works and how kind of, you know, yeah, I mean, just not just the legal system, but kind of the whole governmental process, which I felt very like I don't even really
Yeah.
understand why this thing happened in the way that it did. Um, and so I went to law school without any not something I recommend. I mean, a lot of the other people they'd work as a paralegal, or they had some, their parent was a lawyer or something, or they had some exposure to this kind of thing. And so I went to law school. I really loved it. And
Oh,
then I
really?
started working as an attorney, and I really didn't like it as much.
Why not?
Um, you kind of well, I mean, I can only speak to my own feelings, which is that you kind of felt like the job that I was in. I ended up taking a job working for the Public Defender Service in DC. So I was working with um, kind of working with other attorneys on scientific issues in their cases. So DNA, fingerprint, bullet casing, this kind of thing.
Forensic.
And pardon?
Forensics.
Yeah, forensic stuff, all forensic stuff, plus some other things.
Okay.
But uh, I, the alternative would be to become go to a big law, get a job at a law firm, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't. It's not pleasurable. It didn't sound pleasurable to me. I didn't want to spend 5, 10 years working at a law firm, overworking myself and not being happy. And I also I tend to feel like a lot of the law firms, they a lot of the cases, you're kind of existing to make rich people richer.
Right.
And I didn't. It's not something that I really would find that fulfilling. Um,
So
and
why
then I
not become
clerk.
a prosecutor or something, or work for the
Uh,
state?
I mean, I would sooner become a defense attorney, I guess,
Defense.
because I have serious problems with the criminal justice system.
Okay.
But I mean, not to say, I mean, there are some really great prosecutors out there. I have some friends who are prosecutors. But yeah, I mean, something about it just didn't fit with me.
I mean, what did you
I
like?
enjoyed clerking.
Good. You clerked? Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I clerked for an appellate level judge in DC. I enjoyed that. It was really. I mean, I was very lucky. Both of my bosses out of law school were like fantastic, and I really learned a lot from them. But the further along I got, the more frustrated I got with how courts deal with scientific evidence and how that it's so funny. You read these arguments between multiple lawyers, between a judge, and then a jury is hearing it, and even you might even have various witnesses, and it's like kind of like no one here is this about some scientific issue, and you're kind of like, no one really understands the science here. like everyone is arguing about these things, but you're kind of the way that scientific evidence gets integrated into the court system, I don't think is terribly good. There are some good things about it. And so I really became interested in kind of how do people understand scientific evidence, and how do people kind of learn what science is, and make decisions based on their understanding. And so that's when I saw this program in learning sciences. Again, I did this stupid thing where I was like, yeah, sure, it looks good. Sure, I'll travel across the country, go to grad school. And I think it was really, I was very lucky to meet up with other like-minded people in grad school who,
does that open a lot of doors, either Stanford or their program specifically?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I think so. Stanford is a very open kind of community. I was very lucky. I got a fellowship for a few years, and so that when your funding is tied to a faculty member, you have to kind of do the projects that they're working on. But when you have your own independent source of funding, you can go to anyone and be like, hey, how about I work with you and you don't have to pay me? And for most people, they're like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. And so I was able to connect with someone in the medical school who was doing an interesting project on citizen science, which kind of my main the dissertation my dissertation was basically about that project, about what happens when people who begin without really knowing much science on, say, this particular project was on RNA folding. So if you can design RNA molecules, this is a really great medical technology. But at the time, the algorithms to design RNA molecules weren't that great. And so this project brought in human designers as a kind of video game. It's not, in some ways, it's not that great of a game, but as a kind of to bring people in, you kind of get them to play this game, and then you get them to actually become involved in the scientific process and the testing process. And so the data that I had was basically people starting from zero and people ending up better than any other RNA molecular designer in the world. These are top tier designers that know more and can design better molecules, more effective, designed to specifications than the faculty who are studying this stuff in a lot of cases. So yeah, that was, yeah, I mean, as you can tell, I have just
done a lot of different
off
things.
Course. No, I don't want to do that. I'm going to do this other thing. No, I don't want to do that. I want to do this other thing. So I've been very lucky that I have had that ability to kind of fall into things that interest me.
And so most recently I wanted to just ask you kind of what your experience has been like with this consulting stuff, tech company. Could you kind of explain the different types of consulting, different types of clients you have, and what you do for them?
Sure. So one, like, they probably fall into a handful of different categories. One is straight up research design stuff. So it's like, hey, I have a problem. I want to create a research study that looks into this problem. Maybe it's to do with AI human interaction. Maybe it's to do with, say, like, well, how should we be teaching this thing? But I want to run some kind of experiment. How should I do that? And usually I will take the lead, or maybe have work kind of collaborate with other people to design a research study that focuses on this research question, and then we can analyze the data together and talk about it.
Right.
The other thing that I have done is kind of like, hey, we want to design a learning experience. So we're developing this program. It's going to be a year-long program. We're going to recruit people from here. We're going, like, these are the key learning goals that we have. This is the kind of experience we're going for. Like, can you make this into an effective thing? And usually, again, collaborating with other people to design something that we think is going to be long run effective at kind of matching these learning goals. Trying to think what else have those are like the two main things. I mean, sometimes, you know, I have done some work with like app development and kind of, hey, you know, we have this you know, for a while I was working with this kind of health app that was supposed to help people to develop better habits in kind of eating and exercising and that kind of thing. Well, it's like, okay, well, what should the user interaction be like? You know, how are habits created? And so I'm kind of digging into the research on, you know, like the different, you know, kind of interaction between habits and rewards and habit formation and stuff like that. And then I help them to try to design something that's going to suit their needs.
You mentioned something you turned down, which is the book summarization project. And I thought that'd be an interesting thing for us to talk about, because I've actually gotten a lot of value out of specifically, and we can talk about if you've used ChatGPT at all, but I've got, and I'm going to do a YouTube video about this pretty soon. Just how I found ChatGPT to be really useful for summarizing stuff. It can summarize books, not every book, but especially older books. It can give you a list of every book a certain author has written. It can summarize, kind of write an encyclopedic like entry for you on pretty like connecting ideas between different disciplines. So I'm curious, could you talk more about the dangers of summarization, or
Sure.
the both sides of it, and where you, how you think about it?
Sure. So I mean, I think there, I mean, overall, I mean, this kind of comes back to some of the speed reading stuff too. There is this push, and it's an understandable push for more efficiency in learning. And so, and usually a lot of times when you say efficient learning, people think about consumption of information. So they think like, how can I, you know, consume information more effectively, more quickly? And so I think that's where some of the book summary, this kind of approach to being like, well, you don't have to read the whole book. I'll just give you a short summary. You can get the main points, and then you can move on with your life. And you know, part of this is I don't think that's always a bad thing necessarily, but part of this for me comes into kind of how this kind of warps what people think learning is and what their expectations of what they get out of things. And so I think it's like, if you think that reading a book summary is going to give you the main points and you're going to walk away learning the same things that you learned from actually reading the book, I think that's a serious mistake. That and I mean, so much of learning comes down to knowing what it is you are doing and what you're going to get out of it, rather than like, well, X is right and Y is wrong. And so if you go into it knowing like, oh yeah, this is like reading a book jacket or something, like I'm reading, you know, 4 or 5 paragraphs about this, maybe to see if I like it.
Mhm.
You know, that I think that that's a good attitude, or a good way of kind of, you know, exploring like, oh hey, you know, should I read this, should I read that? But I also, there's a certain aspect to it for me that is about like training yourself to to only care about superficialities. So it's kind of like, if you're so used to skim, it's like if you always skimmed books, for instance, and you never actually read them, then, you know, you get in your mind this idea that like that's what you should do, that's the normal thing, and you don't have the experience of actually deeply reading and understanding something. And this is where I think the idea of learning is kind of consumption or consuming of information, or like I'm just a vacuum and I'm just going to suck things up, is not it can be harmful. At the same time, like what you're talking about with ChatGPT, or yeah, I think there are people that use book summarization apps perfectly reasonably, which is to kind of like get a sense of what the field is, a sense of some of these new ideas, maybe, you know, and then, you know, pick certain things out that you want to focus more on. I mean, I view ChatGPT a little bit. I played around with it a little bit, not a lot, but it's kind of like a more powerful search engine in that you can kind of tell it to combine things in ways, and you can correct it, you know, like because there's a memory of the previous responses and questions that you've asked it. And so, you know, sometimes I'm like, hey, I want this. Oh, it doesn't give me the right thing, but then I can correct it to give it so that it gives me the right thing.
I thought it'd be interesting to, because I wanted to ask you, like, what are 2 or 3 learning projects you're currently working on, and then we can use that as kind of an example. Use one of those
Sure.
as an example.
Uh, so one thing that I've not spent a lot of time working on this. I might be working on this in the future, possibly. But a friend of mine. So sorry, do you want like app oriented like consulting projects, or do you want like personal
No, just
learning kind of
personal. Yeah,
personal
like,
learning? Okay,
yeah.
sounds good. I'll do that. Yeah. Okay. So one thing I'm doing, which I hopefully will release a YouTube video about at some point, is uh, an example of learning from a book, basically, and kind of what I do to. So it's a book on Chinese history, all of Chinese, like a large survey of Chinese history, many hundreds of pages, and kind of, it's a well-written book. I think it has there's a lot of depth to obviously to both the history and the way that it's written.
Mhm.
And so the question is how, you know, I would like to have a really solid understanding of Chinese history. And it's something that a lot of kids learn in school, but then even, I mean, a lot of kids in China and Taiwan and other places learn in school, but then they kind of, you know, you ask them as adults what happened here and what happened there, and their memory of this is relatively sketchy. So what can I do to like deeply understand this history in a way that I feel like, hey, you know, even 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you can ask me something and I'll be able to be like, hey, actually, this is what happened, X, Y, and Z thing. This was an important force going on. You know, this is what at least at the time we didn't know 5 years ago. So that's one learning project that I've been working on. Um, I've been doing like a series of these. I've only released one, but in my mind, I'm doing a series of these
No.
learning challenges. So one is that I released a video on already, is on mental math.
Oh
And
yeah.
really, this is just like a demonstration of how to apply some of these research principles to learn to kind of develop a skill. So I gave myself 40 hours to learn as much as I can on kind of mental arithmetic and kind of get as good as I can at that.
So what was the most advanced level you reached with that?
So far, I mean, I'm doing like squaring 4-digit numbers
Oh,
in my
wow.
head, which is really, really hard.
Yeah.
Squaring 3-digit numbers is quite a bit easier. Um, a lot of the more difficult stuff is with multiplication and some of the larger division problems.
So you ultimately have to carry numbers and use mnemonics to store what you're carrying.
Yes, basically, yes. Yeah, I mean, I've been toying around with the mnemonic stuff. I'm not very good with it yet, which is part of the reason why I kind of suck at some of these large numbers, because I'll drop digits or forget certain things. So I'm trying to get a little bit better at that.
I actually have a course on mental math that I did several years ago, but the whole thing was like, it's only going to be math that you're actually going to use, like calculating a tip and stuff, like, ballpark numbers and stuff. So,
I mean, that's really useful stuff. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I
yeah.
mean, I've started noticing, just like when I go to the grocery store now, and like, oh, I mean, if I'm paying attention, I could just add up all this stuff, and I know exactly how much I, I should owe. And so I know a couple of times I've caught mistakes. I've been like, I don't think that's right.
I think
So
statistical literacy is, you know, kind of talking about the policy stuff you're interested in and thinking rationally about big issues where it's like, well, there's 1 part per million of this, or there's a 0.01% chance this happens, and orders of magnitude and stuff where most people just really struggle with that. Or it's like, there's like, which direction is the causality, or is there causality here? I think, and I saw that in some part of like, that sounds kind of like the citizen science thing. Like you have to have a baseline of that kind of knowledge to really solve a lot of problems. Actually, like you go into your YouTube analytics and like you need to have some statistical understanding to understand what's going on there.
yes, I wish. I mean, and I plan on doing more videos on statistics. I don't know. I don't know whether that's going to get any traction at all,
It
but
probably won't.
it probably won't. It probably won't. I mean, there are already some decent videos there, but the thing is, like, a lot of the videos, or a lot of the content is directed at helping people to pass their classes. And so it's like, oh, this is a t-test. This is what you need to do. Like, this is how you should do it. And this is like what you say at the end. And I've tutored people in statistics and calculus and these things. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's fine to follow all the rules, but that doesn't help people do what you are talking about, which is to think not just statistically, but also like in terms of research design,
Yes.
and like what the design is meant to accomplish, and what can we learn from this, and what kind of is a bridge too far. And I mean, this is something that people argue about, right? It's not like there is always a right answer to everything.
Because
It's
whatever
that
experiment you set up, you're already kind of stacking the deck.
you have to make. Any kind of research study is a series of decisions, a series of trade-offs that you make, and you have to decide. Part of that is deciding what's important, what's not important. And a lot of times, you follow the path down. It's like and you find something you find a little piece, a little nugget, right? But without anything else, that nugget's not worth much, and so it kind of depends on like a bunch of other people doing all their thing, all their nuggets together. And then once we start to get an overall picture of what's going on, then we can start to develop explanations that kind of explain kind of all of the findings, or at least the plurality of findings.
So like with this Chinese history thing, like one of the things I think is important and is kind of old school is I think memorizing dates is important to a certain extent. I think, somewhere between 10 and 100 dates, there's a certain number of dates that are so important that like each decade, or for more ancient history, every 50 or 100 years, you should kind of have some mile marker of like, oh yeah, I don't just have a huge gaping hole where I have no idea. Because for me, a lot of history is also like looking at things that happened in parallel or happened at the same time. And then it's like, was there a causal connection there? And if you don't have those dates, you don't have that insight that, oh, those two things, like that one thing happened right before that other thing, or they even happen in the general same neighborhood. So one of the things I do with history, and it's part of one of my courses, is a set of flashcards with key dates throughout history that I think are just really important to have. And I also think in terms of empires. So I think in terms of like, what was the most powerful empire at a certain point, and like the Chinese empire for long stretches of time, that's probably the key empire that you want to know about. And then you have the British Empire, you have the US Empire. So there's these certain, if you can understand how they kind of hop from one to the other, or they're in parallel, with just understanding a few timelines, you can have a pretty good skeletal structure, kind of backbone of a timeline that then you attach everything else onto. And when you don't have that backbone, history becomes this kind of amorphous, it's like a chain of islands or something.
I actually, I was just thinking about this the other day, and about how right now at this time, I mean, I have a fairly good understanding of certain time periods and certain aspects, and I know like there's certain rough, you know, if you told me like the if you asked me about like the dynasties right now, I'd be able to give you like rough time periods of when they were around. But I I think I agree with what you were saying, in that
I should have
I have
mentioned
the
the Greek
sense,
and Roman Empire too. That's kind of, you have to insert that between the
right,
Chinese ancient and the British
right,
Empire.
like there, I think it's really helpful to have, um as you said, like kind of mile markers, or like to have certain things that, okay, I know, like what I don't think is helpful is to be like, oh, just memorize all these dates and you don't have any of the kind of cartilage that unites them.
Right.
But then exactly like you say, in the same way that we have like a skeleton with like the musculature on top, is like if you have these certain points in time where it's like, I know that happened at that time, and I know this happened at that time, and especially things that have precise dates. I don't know if you've ever played with a game Timeline, where you're trying to, you and your opponent or whatever are trying to place things that happened at certain times, before or after certain things. And actually, it's like there are some events or inventions that it's like, when was this invented? Well, you can sometimes kind of say it was invented 10 years before or 10 years later. Like when does the prototype become an
Printing
actual thing?
press and books is big in terms of China kind of invented it
Yeah,
before the West did.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, like
Gunpowder.
there are certain, it's like some things are more amenable to having a fixed time period. Like this event happened on this day. There is no dispute about it. Other things are more kind of amorphous, so you can say, well, there's just this developmental process that has been going on. But yeah, I definitely think that, I think sometimes people can like focus on memorization too much, and then other times they can kind of not focus on memorization enough, and either case, I think you end up a little bit unbalanced.
So when you're going
um,
through this book, like, are you annotating? Like, what is your general process for taking a book like that and kind of turning it
you
into
know
knowledge in your
I'm not
brain?
even I'm not even convinced I've done the best. I mean, I certainly am convinced I have not done the best thing possible with it. This was kind of like, hey, what if I really want, like, what would I do if I really wanted to do this? And so this is kind of my first pass
Mm-hmm.
through, a book like this. I haven't. I generally speaking, I don't annotate. What I do is I do like free recall sessions after section or a chapter where I sit down with a piece of paper. I try to remember everything I can about what I read. Sometimes I go back through a particular area to kind of fill in the gaps.
Mhm.
I also talk to my wife about the interesting, fun story, some of the stuff that I thought was just so crazy or cool. And then what I try to do, what I'm trying to do now is kind of draw all this stuff together in kind of, there's, it's like you might learn a particular piece, right? A little story that fits into a certain historical timeline, but that,
Yeah.
especially in China, that story sometimes is like another version of an earlier story or another version of a later story. In some ways, like there's certain roles that people play out because history plays such an important role in China that they are always looking to the past in terms of like what the examples are to justify, especially during the earlier dynasties, to justify certain decisions. Like, and so,
And don't they have more of a cyclical theory of history also?
there's certainly there are things that reoccur over and over and over again in terms of like, and people try to model themselves, right? Try to model a certain governmental structure or a certain society off of something that they think had, their perspective of what had gone before.
Mhm.
And so seeing a bit, if you can think of like a bit, and looking at it, you want to look at it from multiple angles, but then you also want to like, hey, can I look at all these same bits together that look the same, as well as see them in the historical context, as well as maybe see them in kind of a different dimension,
Mhm.
looking at it from a different way. So what I try to do is I try to kind of take
A molecule kind of.
the yeah, like take the basic story and then kind of stretch it and see the relationships between certain pieces in different contexts.
Mhm.
And that's kind of one of the main things that I'm trying to do. And I don't know, I'll have a better explanation of what I'm doing when I make the YouTube video.
So what's this
Uh,
book? What's the title of the book? I'm sure people
it's
want
just
to
called China History.
try to
It's
do.
by John Keay. Uh,
Okay.
so yeah.
I'll put that in the description. Um, I actually want to check that out myself. So that's kind of my next project. I just keep on going farther back in history, and um, that's kind of the next big one. All the
Hmm.
different dynasties and stuff. Um, so, uh, is there anything else in terms of kind of old school approach to learning that you want to touch on?
Uh,
Like my overall thing also is that I take more of a minimalist approach. My overall thing is don't get distracted by the shiny objects of a new app or a new thing. Every once in a while, you will have something come along that is a game changer, but most of the time, it's fool's gold, and you should really master the basics in the simplest technology possible before you're looking for some technology to solve problems that are at a more fundamental level, because 99% of the time it's just going to be a band-aid and it's not going to really fix the underlying problem. Like, for example, I find a lot of people getting into these different apps, they're kind of bored with what they're doing. There's a motivation problem, there's a procrastination problem, and so they get into the app and it's kind of exciting for a time, but the real issue is at a deeper level, and they're kind of this is a distraction. So I think breaking things down to the kind of learning science and what are the key principles here of what works and what doesn't, and until you're consistently 80 to 90% of the time doing the right thing in terms of these principles, which almost nobody does, until you hit that, you really shouldn't be concerned with any sort of app or tool that isn't connected to achieving those basic aims.
I will heartily endorse your position. Yes, I think that yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I never really thought about, there kind of being underlying motivational issues and kind of jumping from app to app and kind of wanting something new. Um, I I still think like paper and pencil is a pretty damn good technology. It's a really useful, flexible technology. I think it has some drawbacks because you can't look things up as easily as you can look things up on a computer and this kind of thing. But as far as like quickly um especially like incorporating visualizations and text together in a fluid way, I feel like paper and pencil is just it's great for that.
I think a
And
lot of
and
people don't realize how like if you read a book from 50, 100 years ago, or a paper or a dissertation, and some of these people who wrote dozens of books and they weren't even using computers,
mm,
it makes you realize you can climb huge mountains with none of this technology. And until you have a good theory of how were all these people able to do all this stuff without computers and without apps, there's a way to do it. And so all of this other stuff is kind of extraneous, makes it easier, makes it faster, but fundamentally all of this stuff is possible without any of these tools.
I think that's right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's not to say that, not to discourage people from exploring things. I think it's really important to explore different. I mean, I kind of always want to be in the mode of like, yeah, well, maybe I'll try this out, see how this works for a little while. Um, but but I agree that like having just good fundamental learning skills comes before all any kind of adoption of new technologies or apps or um yeah, I
One
don't
other
know.
kind of fun question is I've done a few videos on Kim Kardashian's self-education path through law school.
Okay,
And
I know nothing about this.
no,
This is awesome.
I know,
Okay.
but she basically did the first year and she took a baby bar in California, which is just the first year of law school is very much a template of like 5 basic courses for the most part.
Hmm.
And so it's, I guess I'm just curious how difficult is it to go through. I think a lot of people are kind of intimidated by law school and legal thinking, but um, how difficult is it really? What is it that makes it difficult or like to me a lot of it is the archaic language. You've got language that goes back several hundred years and it kind of only continues in the legal tradition, and then you've got there's a whole legal ontology of very specific categories and subcategories of things that you tend to not tease apart the distinctions in normal life.
Mm.
And you're learning all of these frameworks and stuff, but it's not necessarily the most complicated or difficult. Like, how difficult is it? I mean, I can only
I,
say so much. You've actually gone through it.
I think one is that it involves a lot of reading. If you don't like reading, there's going to be some problems because you just like you're just reading case after case after case after case. I think to some degree, the structure of law school makes it more difficult than the material actually merits, because um, I mean, this is changing. This is different than I think it was, but there's a little bit of hiding the ball. So it's like there's, rather than kind of give you a conceptual structure like, hey, this is what a contract is, and this is what promissory estoppel is, and these, promissory estoppel is basically a form of contract where I promise, you know, I make a promise to you, and then I break my promise, and you're harmed in some way. Um, and it's like, rather than just stating that, or rather than giving students conceptual frameworks to begin with, you kind of have students read the cases a lot and try to dig into the cases and understand what they mean, which on the one hand, I think is useful because you're developing this skill. One of the skills you want to develop is very close reading and understanding of these cases. But then on the other hand, there are plenty of times when I feel like it's like, why did you have to make this so hard? Just
Right.
tell me what the basic structure is. I read a book, I think in my second year or something, called The 5 Types of Legal Argument. It's a very good book, very simple book, short, to the point, and just gives people examples of, these are the kinds of arguments that you see, that you run across. And I'm not sure if I remember all of them, but there's like an argument for policymaking, right? Like, what will this rule create? Like, what kind of incentives does this rule create? There's an argument from, like the text of like, what do the words actually mean that we're talking about here? There's an argument from intent, like what did the lawmakers really intend to do when they created this law? And different arguments are more or less relevant in different situations. But I wish someone would have just given me this book as a first year, and it would have made things a lot easier. So I don't think, in some sense, I don't think that fundamentally the material is super challenging, but I think that the leap from being an undergrad to being a law student is large. Like you can get away with,
Because there's so much reading. Is there what is it
so
beyond
much reading, and there's a lot more of the weight is a lot more on the student to figure things out.
Sink or swim.
And I think that like in undergrad you can get away with not doing much. There are students that do a lot, and there are students that really push themselves and do amazing things. But I was not one of those students. I just kind of coasted. And then when I went to law school, I was like, oh, this is what undergrad should have been. Like I should have been engaged at this level, and like really like tearing these cases apart. To be in a community, it's not just the teachers and the whole setup. It's also like being in a peer community where everyone is really trying to learn this stuff deeply. That is, and then there are people that are just like, I don't know, this person knows the stuff better than me, or has spent more time thinking about this than me. I
got the sense,
nice thing.
I got the sense that the review books, like a bar review book, has a lot of that explanation. It is more like a textbook, and for whatever reason, it sounds like the pedagogy of what they had at Cornell was not. They had a certain kind of case-based theory of learning.
Yeah, I mean that's most law schools. You don't learn this is why people spend 3 months studying for the bar. Like you don't learn the stuff that you need to pass the bar. You kind of develop a like general fundamental understanding of how the law works, and you've taken these fundamental classes in the first year, but by the time you're graduating in your third year, you don't recall a lot of that. You may not have studied the laws of your specific state at all.
How did you prep for the bar?
Oh, I did the same thing other people do. I didn't take Barbary. I took Themis, which was an up and coming bar prep company.
How do you spell that? Cheaper. Is that still around?
Themis. I hope it is. I mean,
I haven't heard of it.
I mean, I think the bar prep is kind of a racket. I mean, it is not kind of a racket. It is a racket. And I think that, people are spending, I don't know how much it was.
Seemed like there are a few, 2,000-3,000 if it's not classes. I mean, if you're going, some people do like classes, right?
Right. Yeah. Some people, yeah.
So you didn't do that. You got kind of the package of, you get a bunch of books, there's flashcards, maybe there's an online component. Video. That's what they have now, the videos.
They had online videos. It was like huge. I mean, the question bank is really what what I spent the majority of my time doing. I mean, I would try to read the summaries and listen to the lectures, but then a lot of it is just like, hey, take a section of a test yourself on that, figure out which ones you got wrong. Why did you get them wrong? Okay, let's do it again. And there's just a very repetitive aspect to it of kind of Well, you just keep kind of keep taking. I mean,
Plowing
I
away
just
at it.
take a lot of practice tests and try to fill in the gaps. I am trying to make sense of things with outlines or whatever, but mostly it was the question bank that was really
And you,
helpful.
and that's the same with medical school also, is that a lot of emphasis is on the practice questions. I think where maybe it's a little different is the flashcards. I get the sense that with UFSMLE, especially step one, at least until they made it pass fail, there's a lot of emphasis on the flashcards, 10,000, 20,000 flashcards. Whereas Barbary, I don't think it's more than maybe 1,000 or 2,000 flashcards.
Yeah, I don't remember using any flashcards at all.
Yeah.
For
And you also did the New York bar, which is known to be one of the most difficult.
Yeah, I mean,
Right?
I think New York and California kind of have a
Yeah,
reputation.
California.
California, I think I mean, at least New York, is New York 2 days? California 3 days? I can't even remember right now.
California is also very difficult.
Extremely difficult, yeah.
Kamala Harris passed the bar there, and she was a prosecutor in California. Okay, so any thoughts on classical education? Like reading the classics, or and even like the Western classics versus Chinese classics. Do you ever get into that at all? Reading the great books.
I have mixed feelings about it, I guess. I mean,
Yeah,
I
what do you
think
think about it?
that that I think that people get very used to reading modern writing, and so when they read something that isn't set up the way that they expect things to be set up, with the pacing, I mean, it's kind of like watching, I don't know now. I mean, now there's a million other shows, but the show that comes to mind is like Game of Thrones or something, where you have the cliffhangers, you have the hooks in the beginning, everything is like that, and a lot of modern writing has kind of, same thing of
Formulaic.
making YouTube videos. You have the hooks, you have everything, and it's built in for this kind of rapid consumption, and content is constantly being put out. And so I think that reading not just classical literature, but also, or I guess classical Western literature, but also like reading literature from a wide variety of contexts. There's part of it that is just learning how to read that kind of literature, learning how to read, a different style and appreciate a different style. I think that there is that, I mean, I wish to some degree that we spent more time, reading certain very good things that were written long ago. But there are also trade-offs. I mean, I think that we only have, I mean, let's say as a K-12 student or something like this, or even through college, like you only have X amount of time to read, and there is just an insane amount of stuff to read. Like, I wish people got more exposure to Eastern cultures, like Japanese culture, Korean, Chinese, and even I mean, places you never heard of before, places that students have never heard of before. Like, I wish that students got more exposure to some of these, like, yeah, I remember reading Things Fall Apart. I don't know if you know this book. It's like there's certain of these books that, like, I wish just students got more exposure to, or more exposure to the culture generally.
Is that African? Things Fall Apart?
Yeah, African, and yeah. Okay. It's been a while since I read it, but at the same time, I don't necessarily think it's like super important that everyone has to read the exact same books and everyone has to have this common culture. But I do think that it's nice to have some overlap, wide exposure, and then also some overlap. But
what is there anything, spending time in Japan and in China, how has that influenced the way you learn? Are there any And are there any classics in particular that you read from those cultures that you would recommend or that you particularly enjoyed?
So what is it? The Tale of Genji is like one of the first novels written. And it's kind of this, I don't know if you'd call it like a romantic kind of
As a female
uh
author.
yeah. And it's written, it's kind of the intrigues at the court and the intrigues with kind of the upper classes kind of
Mhm.
thing. I remember reading it a long time ago, or reading parts of it a long time ago, and kind of enjoying it. I, I think that I've also read through the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is one of the four great
Four
works
greats,
of
yeah.
literature in Chinese history. There's Romance of the Three Kingdoms, The Water Margin, or Outlaws of the Marsh, and uh, The Dream of the Red Room or something. And then there's another one that I'm forgetting right now. Oh, The Monkey King. And those, like, I mean, this is probably overstating the case a little bit, but in some ways, it's like those are kind of similar to the Bible in some ways, where it's like there are stories that are written there that are referenced over and over again and play such a huge role in, you know, in Chinese culture, that, I think it's cool to read that stuff. And even if you don't, I remember I was reading some book, I can't remember, but it's like, even if you don't read, like, the Tale of Genji is relatively long, you don't have to read it all to kind of read a little bit and gain some appreciation for what's going on, and kind of be like, oh, that's an interesting take on things, interesting book, interesting flow. I mean, you obviously lose
And that
something in the
especially is the kind
translation.
of book that's a collection of stories. It's not necessarily like a one grand
I think
narrative.
I think that's right. Yeah. Um, if I could recommend one classic book,
Yeah.
I would recommend The Man Without Qualities. It is an extremely hard read. I am not yet finished with it. I'm not even sure. I don't even
Who
know
wrote
when I will
that?
be
I'm not
finished
familiar with that.
with it. Thomas Musil, I think. His last name is Musil, definitely Musil. It's about
When was it
Australia.
published roughly?
It's published after, I think it's between the wars,
Okay.
after World War One. It's basically about Austria, or the Austrian Hungarian Empire, at the, like, pre-World War One stage, and pretty much nothing happens in it. It's basically the story of um, a, a committee that gets put together to try to celebrate the emperor's birthday, because he's been emperor for a long time. And that's basically the and kind of the intrigues that happen because of that. But mostly it's a philosophical treatise. There are
Mhm.
so many great quotes from the book that, I mean, you can just pick it up and, like, turn to a random page, read a few pages, and just be like, damn, that is such a apt description of the modern world. And it was written 100 years ago almost. So but again, it is a very hard read. I don't know that many people will, like, yeah, it's not something that I can sit down and read for long periods of time. I kind of read a little bit at a time. I put it aside. I come back to it a little later. So
To kind of round things out, I'm curious if you mentioned playing strategy game with your son from time to time, but is there anything else you're doing to kind of take what you've learned about learning science to, uh, shape your kids' education?
it's hard. I mean, it's hard because, like, kind of what you said, you're embedded into an educational community, and he right now he goes to school here in Taiwan. It's a pretty traditional. His teacher is a pretty traditional teacher, and so he has tons of homework every night. And so it's not like I want to add on to his burdens, brings him a fair amount of anxiety.
Right.
And so most of it is also, like, kind of managing, like, hey, you're in first grade. We don't really care that you do all this homework. Like, you don't, kind of try to manage his stress and anxiety. But we've done, like, during the pandemic, we did some kind of reading lessons with him, and math lessons. He, you know, a lot of it at this stage, at this early stage, I feel like is more about shaping his understanding of what learning is. So, kids, they'll get frustrated because they can't do something well. And, when they do that, you try to move them in this direction of like, it's okay, like you can't do it well now, but you just need to practice, and you try to find examples where it's like, hey, you couldn't ride a bike before, but then you practiced and now you're riding a bike like crazy, and it's like that, you have to keep practicing, and so kind of developing the right perspective on learning, I think is important at the early stages. And of course we do a lot of, I mean, this isn't really intentional, but it's kind of, we ask open-ended questions. A lot of times I think parents are too quick to kind of tell kids what the right answer is, or to kind of stop them, um, uh, before they make a mistake. So we kind of, I want him to, so when we're doing math, for example, I have a video on this coming out actually in a few weeks, but when we're doing math, for example, it's like, hey, he wants to sit and think about the problem. That's
Mhm.
great. We want to encourage that kind of behavior, and just like not, you know, and then when you get something wrong, it's not like, of course, you don't want people to be like, that was wrong, you're stupid, you made a mistake. But it's kind of like, oh, close. Like, let's go back and understand it from this way, or let's use multiple different perspectives to try to understand why the answer is this. Um,
Kind of going
so,
back to the law school experience, I see a commonality here with both law school and medical school. I think that the pacing of these things is extremely aggressive, and
mm,
it's not really necessary that it actually be that way. And and so when you're learning on your own, you can kind of take your time and do things at the pace that you enjoy. And I think a fair amount of people getting turned off from learning is where they really were just not doing it at a comfortable pace. And they were
mm,
like having to read 10 hours a day or 12, or like just mountains of homework. And if you just split it up over a longer period of time, it wouldn't be so bad. Um, and then the thing that I kind of struggle with is K through 12. I look at what a lot of other countries do, that they do have these big standardized tests. Brazil, India, China, for
mm,
example. I
mm,
think Korea and Japan, where it seems that especially the Eastern countries tend to do a lot better with the math and science. And I think there's a lot of evidence that, and I think this was in one of your videos, where like you really can't just get 9 out of 10 questions right. You have to get 99% of those, 9 out of 100. Like those, I think a lot of people, and I see this in myself as well with a lot of things that I learned in school, is you really do have Swiss cheese knowledge where you, there's so many missing pieces and you kind of have to redo the whole thing. And when you think really scientifically about what's required to actually remember stuff, you basically would have to have some kind of spaced repetition on each atomic piece, and you multiply it by the millions of things you have to learn. It's a huge kind of Manhattan level project almost, and for an individual to do that is so beyond the bounds of what almost anybody can do. And so I don't know. Summer vacation is something we have in the U.S. That's potentially an issue, but I think that people just lose stuff, and I know I lost stuff just from year to year in math. But like when you're building this edifice of knowledge, people don't fully realize how many holes there are in what they're building on, and so to really fix the problem, you'd have to go back so far to build back up those fundamentals that it's almost a insurmountable task. So
yeah,
I'm just curious, kind of culture to culture. I feel like a lot of Americans get kind of lazy. They don't, we're kind of falling behind, and I think part of it is a just wanting to be comfortable and not realizing the competitive dynamics of this stuff. And then part of it is also like America is very creative, and there are these other things that are valuable. So it's an interesting struggle and trade-off, and I'm curious how you think about it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
Because I think a lot of this rote memorization and rote learning stuff actually needs to be done, and we don't do enough of it. But it's about doing it the right way, and all the stuff you talk about.
yeah. I mean, there's some. I mean, I do think that there's some times when memorizing things is just really important, and sometimes there's a book that I can't remember the author's name. It's called The Knowledge Gap, but basically she talks about how teachers in the States have emphasized, like I'm not teachers. I mean, it's really the policy making that is occurring, that is coming down from administrations onto teachers, has emphasized quote unquote skills rather than knowledge. And I mean, I think skill development is really important, but you can't really have one without the other. You can't just you can't be a doctor and be diagnosing ailments if you don't understand what those ailments are and what the signs are and everything like that. So I think that's one thing, and you see this in the push for there's been a big push for more students to take calculus at the high school level. But when you look at the research of whether this is an actual good idea, like what has been the outcome of this, well, I forget what percentage, but a crazy high percentage of students who took calculus in high school just have to retake it again in college to get credit for it because they don't understand the fundamentals very well. And you see this, it's funny because you have this anxiety in the US, I think, of like, oh, we're falling behind, we need to hurry up. And so they just try to run really fast. And it's like, no, that just ends up like exacerbating the problem because you're not really focused on the fundamentals in the first place. Something I noticed here actually watching my kid do these math lessons is actually, the stereotype of Eastern mathematics education is a rote method. But when you actually look into what they do, at least in Japan, and now I've seen a little bit here, and there's more research. There was kind of research in the late 90s, early 2000s on what Japan was doing in math education. And like there's like more rote learning going on in the US than there was in Japan when people were doing that research, because what they would do is they would ask students to solve a problem, and if they would get it wrong, they would talk about why that was wrong, go over and understand like different kinds of solutions to the same problem, which gives people a deeper understanding of kind of these solution methods and the nature of the problems. And I've seen here with my son doing the math. Actually, the math homework is like the one thing that I think is pretty decent, because some of the exercises are like, okay, this is helping the kid to develop a really deep understanding of number sense and kind of like, certain like, filling in the gaps in these like seeing number patterns. Sometimes it's like they see a pattern and then they have to guess what's the next pattern. They started off doing very simple things of like, hey, here's a squiggly line, here's a more squiggly line, which one is longer? To develop a sense of kind of length. They have a number of these conceptual things that I think are actually pretty decent. They do some silly things too, but I think that the problem that you talked about, where it's kind of this phrase Swiss cheese knowledge is perfect. I feel like because so many people have these missing gaps, and I think part of it is a little bit of, it's like, if you really wanted to emphasize rote memorization, then we could do a much better job of it. But if you could, like, I don't think people spend enough time organizing their knowledge at a higher abstract level. If you start working at a high level and you have to be working with the facts and you're applying knowledge in realistic scenarios more frequently than I think happens here, where we kind of accept that if you're good at solving these abstract math problems, then you get the checkbox. But if you look at the experiences that kids have in math, very few of those experiences are actually using mathematics in a way to solve a natural problem, or to use mathematics to model a realistic problem. And it involves simplification, it involves a series of decisions. And so to some degree, I think the problem is too, just like, we never give kids these kinds of experiences. We don't emphasize those kinds of experiences as much as I think we could.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
I think Sal Khan's implementation of mastery learning with the Khan Academy is really big, because it takes you back. It sees where the mistake is, and then it forces you to go back and relearn the thing you're missing. And I think what chat like Bill Gates and others have been looking at this for a long time, this idea of a tutor, a personal AI tutor for each student, that can even kind of take that to the next level of everybody has a tutor one-on-one that they can get personalized help with, and the AI can kind of figure out what you need exactly when you need it and give you that personalized experience. So I think it it could just be because of the scale of how you have to do learning, and everybody has to kind of go at the same pace. There's a lot of these built-in structural issues that it's hard or impossible to fix some of this stuff. um, you get to the point where you have to accept a fair amount of slippage, and with this kind of technology where you can give people personalized help, you probably can fix some of that stuff. So um, it is a complicated issue. Is there any I was going to actually ask you, is there anything like Khan Academy in terms of, like, are there apps or websites or services that you, or schools that you think do education really well, that serve as kind of role models for you? And then we can wrap up with any final thoughts you want to share.
Sure. That's a good question. Someone had forwarded me a language learning thing that I thought looked pretty decent. But I think Link for language learning, Link or Ling or Link. I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced.
LINQ, maybe.
LINGQ, I
Oh,
think,
GQ. Okay.
or L. Yeah. Um, that's actually created by Steve Kaufman, who's a polyglot YouTuber. I think that's pretty decent. I think that there's a new app that I think was just released to the public like 2 days ago or 3 days ago. It's called Super Teacher.
Hmm.
A friend of mine helped to design and create it. It's basically a startup company that's building it, and it's kind of similar to what you just suggested, where it's basically like an interactive tutoring program. Right now it's geared towards kids, I think like 5 to 8 or 4 to 8 or something. And what it does is there's natural language processing. So the lessons are designed by teachers and subject matter experts, and then there's natural language processing, so the kid can respond to questions that the teacher. So it's like you're interacting with a teacher, a virtual teacher, but the way that they've structured the questions, and the way that the AI is kind of responding naturally to kids' questions or kids' answers to certain questions.
Mm-hmm.
And the same lesson for two different students looks a little bit different, because they've built in different paths that students can take depending on their responses. And so, like, you solve a problem really well, they're going to give you more challenging problems. You solve problems not so well, or you make certain kinds of mistakes, they're going to focus on those mistakes to help you understand. So you're going to, the same lesson with different kids is going to look slightly different. But that's it's an interesting example. I think it could develop into something that I think is pretty valuable.
Yeah. So, are there any other things that you'd like to point people to in terms of your website, your YouTube channel? I'll put links in the description, but any final thoughts you want to leave people with?
Um, no, I guess not. I mean, yeah, if you visit my YouTube channel, we're grateful to you. I'm starting an email newsletter soon. I've been this week is my first one. I'll be releasing them once a week, so you can sign up on my website there.
That's
Yeah,
benjaminkeep.com. So that'll be down below. Benjamin, thanks a lot for coming on. It's a pleasure talking to you. And
my pleasure.
I'll be keeping an eye on the YouTube channel. You've got a lot of cool stuff there. So I highly recommend people check it out and subscribe.
Awesome. Thank you, Timothy.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So